So we now have Richard to lead our Bible study, which is looking really cool because we've got like 3 texts to look at, which is great. So the Reverend Canon Dr. Richard Cooke is the rector of 6 rural churches near Stratford-upon-Avon, and has been in church ministry for over 40 years in a variety of contexts, particularly apparently in teaching and training roles. So I'm telling you that. It feels weird to introduce somebody without at least looking at them once, you know? So we'll be exploring washing feet, turning the other cheek, and taking up the cross. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Good. Well, nice to be here. In the teaching and training stuff, I had an excellent member of staff who was called Naomi Nixon, which is probably why I'm here today, I think. I should just say to you that if I wince when you say something, it's not because of what you said. It's because we were on holiday a couple of weeks ago, and we've got an almost 6-year-old Labrador who has just discovered that if she brings the ball back and lets it go, then you can throw it again for her. So this was a new thing, fantastic game to do. And we have one of those plastic dog throwers, you know, you don't actually throw a dog, you throw the ball. Slightly misnamed. And so I was very enthusiastically with my right arm throwing this ball. The dog was chasing after it. We both had a wonderful time. And then when we got home, I found I'd got a problem with my shoulder. So it's still a bit painful. So if I wince, as I say, it's not because of what you said. It's just because of my dog throwing injury. It's not the most kind of impressive injury to have, really, is it? Anyway, lovely to be here with you. And we're going through till 4 o'clock with this one, aren't we? Like Rachel, it's always a good idea to check on the time beforehand. And we're going particularly to have a look at that passage in Luke chapter 6. I hope you've all got a copy of this. I thought it was going to be easier to do that than assume that people have got Bibles with them. But in order for it to work with the live stream, there's probably a bit less of you talking with one another than I might normally do with something like this. But do feel free to interrupt or ask things as we go along. Observations are equally as important as questions. So, or challenges or whatever. So if that's all right, we'll carry on. So the theme for today, as we all know, is do good to those who hate you. There are kind of 2 versions of this in the New Testament. One is the passages from Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. But there is a slightly different version, which is what the quotation we've got in the material for the conference is from, in Luke's Gospel, in what really people often call not the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the Plain. He summarises Jesus' teaching slightly differently. And the wording is different from what you get in the Sermon on the Mount as well. And having a look at this, I thought, it would be quite intriguing just to dig into what those differences are and why they might be different, and actually what it might suggest to us. One of the important things for us to look at, I think, is we're very conscious of our own context, but it's really easy to read our own context back into other texts, particularly the Gospels. And in fact, giving attention to Jesus' context and looking at the differences and connections between the two is often important. So let's try and do that with this passage. Jesus talking about love your enemies and so on. What do you think he was talking about? What's the same and what's different about Jesus' context and our context today? Get what I'm asking about here. And, you know, there's no right or wrong answers to this, so don't think that we're kind of marking your homework on it at all. But just take a moment or two to chat to the person next to you about what you think is the same and what's different between Jesus' context and our context. Okay? Let's just see what has come down to that. What do you think is the same about Jesus' context and ours, and what might be different? We've got the microphone around for the live stream as well, I think. So anybody want to throw something out? What's the same? Go on then, Phoebe, yes.
We were talking about maybe the difference between what you're kind of calling state-given enemies. So like when your region is officially at war with another region, you're told that that is your official enemy, whereas obviously we can debate about this, but we're not technically in a war right now, so we haven't got state-given enemies. Whereas I try and think about who mine might be, and I'm instantly trying to think more personal. I haven't got any personal enemies that I know of. And then I'm thinking about, well, who kind of officially could I say is my enemy? Well, they don't know I exist, but like I would say like people like Netanyahu, and then he's not personally attacking me, but he's attacking a community on a genocidal level. But again, that's such a different context, and kind of made him an enemy because of advocacy for another community, and he doesn't know me. At least I hope he doesn't know me.
Although you have spent time.
Yes, I have. Yeah. We didn't cross paths.
You just said on the live stream now that you're a national ID.
Don't mind.
Okay, let's quickly move the microphone on to Phoebe then. But thank you very much for that, Phoebe. That's great. Anybody else got something to throw in for us? Yeah.
You go first. Yeah, so we were talking about how these people, they would have had enemies.
Yep.
And they would have been born their enemies. And also the other thing is that when we're reading this today, we've had 2,000 years of this message printed in our minds. And for these people, they hadn't. And this, we've got to bear in mind just how radical and also counterintuitive, and how it just would have gone against the grain of their psychology.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you for that. Yeah.
And then a point I just held on the end was Jesus, as far as we know, didn't have Instagram or Twitter or X or whatever. So that's a different. I
think pretty certain you're right on that. Yes. But no, I mean actually the communications thing is important, isn't it? Because more or less everything that's done in that culture is broadly speaking fairly local, whereas virtually anything you say, as Phoebe may be about to find out, is broadcast much wider. Sorry to pick up. Phoebe's mum and I work together. So.
It's all sounding very connected.
Okay. Tim?
So I'm just the difference between Jesus's context and Luke's context might need to be teased out a little bit as well. When Jesus was around, the Roman Empire was all powerful in first century Judea, but there was issues of collaboration and so on. By the time Luke's writing, the fall of Jerusalem has happened, and there's been the diaspora and both the spreading of Christianity, but also the dispersal of Judaism as well. So in terms of understanding of who your enemy is, might be different for Jesus as opposed to when Luke's writing and interpreting it, because by that point people were trying to maybe play a little bit more nicely at times with the Roman Empire and trying to work out how to just survive and not get thrown to the lions or into the general Colosseum and so on. So I think we need to be mindful that there is the Bible offers us the challenge of both what we understand the person saying 30, 40, 50 years earlier, but then there's also the context of the writer themselves as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's that extra level of interpretation. Because we've got less than an hour to do this, I'm not really going into that, but it's a really important point, Tim, thank you for it, that there is both our context, Jesus' context, and then, of course, in between that is a kind of mediating context of the writer of this particular gospel, and this may be why there is some slight differences between Luke and Matthew, for example, because they're interpreting Jesus' words for different audiences. In this particular case, this passage, I'm not sure that is hugely important, or I shall assume that it isn't, but you're absolutely free to differ with me on that if you want to. Anybody else? Time for one more? No?
Sarah? It's not that important, but
No, but we want you to be broadcast to the world so that if you mention...
Just in case I say anything like startlingly important to any security agencies. Yeah, no, understood. We were just talking about like some of the most of what we have in common with the people at that time are things about being human. And particularly, I was thinking about grouping those into our needs in terms of just, you know, eating and drinking and shelter and so on. But then also in terms of emotions, in terms of the way that the anger is still anger even 2,000 years ago, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
On translation.
Yeah. Sorry?
Or just simply translation.
Yes.
Done by individuals, and they all do things slightly differently. So what you get from a given text is never going to be identical.
Yeah. And in fact, I'll pick that up in a moment or two. One thing about Jesus' context that actually we often don't grasp, I think, is that Galilee was not an occupied area. The way the Roman Empire ran was that they used Roman soldiers, legions, as little as they could because they were incredibly expensive. It's rather the way in which various imperial powers have tried to run empires in the past. So, in fact, Galilee, you know, at the time, Palestine split into Galilee, which is the northern part, and Judea, which is the southern part, which includes Jerusalem itself. But that northern part, Galilee, where Jesus seems to have spent most of his time, is actually ruled by Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. And that's important because he's a Jewish ruler. So if this passage, as we often interpret it, is talking about how you react if somebody, it doesn't say that they're soldiers or whatever, but the likely context is that the sort of people that Jesus is talking about reacting to are forces who are wanting to take taxes from you, move you off land, all that kind of thing. It's not a Roman centurion who's doing this. The enemy that seems to be talked about here is in fact almost certainly another Jewish person who's working as an agent at a couple of removes for the Roman Empire, but in fact is somebody who is very, very much like you. It's a collaborator, and that, when I think about it, changes the way that I look at this passage and actually does resonate a bit with our context if we're talking about how you talk to your far-right neighbours. Because it's not talking about people who are very other. Do you see what I mean? It's talking about people who might be your brother or your father or your son, because I'm assuming they'll probably be male. But actually people who are very close to you, the people that you might have gone to school with, people that might be part of your wider family, all that sort of thing. So when we look at this, I think it actually takes us into territory which is quite close to what we were hearing about this morning. Enemies and neighbours, I don't see necessarily as different groups. Because in Jesus' context in Galilee, I think enemies and neighbours could well have been the same people. Do you see what I'm getting at there? And that's one where, as I was thinking this through, I thought, there actually does seem to be quite a resonance there, doesn't there? One of the books that's around on sort of far-right stuff at the moment had this phrase in it, which I thought was helpful. Daniel Trilling says, in order to feel like a winner, somebody has to lose. In order to feel like a winner, somebody has to lose. And if that's a true statement about our context, it's interesting to put that into the kind of New Testament context and say, is the same thing, the same kind of power differential going on there? And arguably, in Galilee particularly, it was. Because how did you get on? How did you make money? How did you make your own family secure? Well, being part of Herod Antipas, the ruler's security services and all of that, might have been a smart bet to do. I'm not saying that they're the same as far-right supporters now. I'm saying there are similarities there, and teasing that out can be helpful. So in that sense, it seems to me that Jesus' context is there where you're in Galilee, which is not an occupied land at the time. He's talking about people who are enemies and people who are neighbours, and they might be the same people. What do you do to them? Well, according to Luke, Jesus says, do good. That's not a great phrase in English, is it? Does anybody like do-gooders? No, they don't. You know, it's a pejorative term for us. So I thought, well, what have we actually got here? Now, bear in mind, Jesus would have said whatever he said in Aramaic, so we've already got translation into Greek here. But when you look at it, the phrase is really quite suggestive, because the words do good are kalos poete. Good, kalos poete, means do. Greek has New Testament Greek has a much greater breadth of meaning in each word because the vocabulary is much smaller than English. So there are a lot more ideas going on in any one word in New Testament Greek than there are in English. And we miss that because our translations nail down meaning. They make it much tighter, when in fact often it's more ambiguous and in many ways quite poetic. Kalos, the word that we translate as good, means beautifully, or soundly, morally rightly, or orderly. There's all of that stuff in it, which for me doesn't really fit in the word good in this context. But once you begin to think of that, then it feels to me as if this phrase begins to blossom a bit. When Jesus is described in John's Gospel as the Good Shepherd, it's this same word that's used, and that's why some people translate that as the Beautiful Shepherd, which again puts it slightly differently, I think. And the word for doing is a lovely word, poete, which means to do, but it means to make or create or fashion something. We actually get the word poetry from this Greek word. So it's not just that very instrumental doing something. There's something far richer there, I think, about a sense of creating something, making something happen. Put those together, and I think what you get here is a sense that when Jesus says do good, he's talking about order and beauty as opposed to chaos. Do good to those that hate you is not just being nice to them. It's to do with this sense of order as opposed to chaos, which of course goes right back, particularly to the Genesis stories, where what God does with the creation is bring order out of chaos. So doing good, perhaps, has got something to do with bringing back that sense of harmony. You'll know the Hebrew word shalom, I'm sure. That sense of peace, order, of bringing everything to be right. So this kind of word to do good feels to me like it's actually got a much richer kind of hinterland to it than we think when we just sort of skid through it and think, okay, we've got to be good, do-gooders. You might translate it, it's a bit of a stretch, more of a paraphrase, but it kind of helps me to understand it. What if Jesus is really saying, make something beautiful to those who hate you? Make something beautiful. How do you make something beautiful out of this situation? He's talking in that context, we're talking in our context, but the challenge to make something beautiful there, I think, is a rich and resonant one. So what do we do about it? Here's what Jesus says. I've turned the phrases around, but to cursing, bless. To threats, pray. To slaps, offer the other cheek. To demands for your coat, let them take your shirt too. There's a link there, because if you go back into the Old Testament law, Exodus and Deuteronomy, you find that actually you're not meant, the people of Israel are not meant to take all these clothes from somebody else, because that means that they would become destitute. You're not allowed to do that. That's not going to make any difference if it's a Roman soldier, but if it's one of Herod Antipas's Jewish soldiers, effectively all of these actions, I think, are about shame. It's about shaming somebody who does them. Do you really want to do this? What are your actual value? What is your actual value system? And I heard some resonances with what Bishop Aaron was talking about when he'd spoken to some of the people, the far-right protesters, and actually asked them what did they really think. There's a kind of a sense of shame going on, it felt to me, in some of those conversations. Sorry, you were going to ask me?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I believe there's a thing, I don't remember if it's in this bit, but where Jesus says that if someone asks you to carry their bag a mile,
yes,
carry it too. And that was a thing that people were it was an expectation that if a Roman soldier asked you had to carry their bag a mile, and actually going 2 miles is an act of protest, because that was more than you were expected.
Yes, that's in the Sermon on the Mount rather than this one. But again, if you read it in a Jewish rather than a Roman context, it's talking about forced labour. And forced labour is has a kind of big history in what we think of as the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, where the big mistake that was made after the death of Solomon with the kings that come in there was they brought in forced labour. And that caused all kinds of problems and stuff. So again, when you dive into it at that level, you begin to see that this is questioning the value system that might underlie the person who's labelled as the enemy, but might also be your neighbour as well. What it seems to me Jesus is doing here is offering concrete actions. He's saying these are things to do. Sometimes these are talked about as acted parables, which I find is quite a helpful phrase. It's not just about words, and very much as Rachel was pointing out this morning, these are confrontations. This is not just passive resistance in the sense that you lie down and let somebody walk on over you. It's about doing something in response, something that confronts the person who's doing it to you with a real challenge. That says, do you actually want to do this? Is this really the person that you are? That's the question that goes on here, I think. And the kind of, this little part of the passage ends up with this phrase about be merciful or be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. Be merciful. It's that sense that what you do here, the actions, are actions that reflect the nature of God. Jesus resists the idea that for someone to feel like a winner, someone else has to lose. Going back to that quote I gave you just now. That's what he's resisting. It's arguing back against the model of the world that somebody seems to have. It's asking, do you really want to participate in that model of the world? The challenge is not to play the game. I'm not really going to talk about Bonhoeffer here because there are people much more qualified to do that. But you can see the connections, can't you, between the two things. How do you manage not to play the game? Arguably, this is a huge oversimplification, I know, and again, plenty of people here will know more about this than me. But one way of understanding what's going on today, not just in this country but across the world, is that there is a clash between liberal democracy and capitalism. That liberal democracy fundamentally encourages us to think that everybody should be equal. Capitalism does the opposite. And when those two things clash, actually what you get is that sense of anger, desire for revenge, that sense that actually I want my people to be winning, not yours. And that's what fuels the kind of politics of resentment, really, that we see around us. That sense of equality at the heart of liberal democracy seems to me, and again I know that this is potentially a contentious thing, but it seems to me to have quite deep Christian roots, and you'll probably be aware of the background to that kind of argument. And in that context, it's concrete actions, such as Jesus talks about here, that I think make a difference rather than arguments. And just a brief bit of autobiography. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, but when I was a student, a long time ago now, I was involved in a sort of student mission thing in North London. And we were a bunch of students from Oxford University, and we had all the arguments in our heads. I actually lost an argument with a secondary school class about which was better, the Beano or the Bible, which told you something about how good I was at arguing at the time. But you know, there was a lot in our understanding of what we were doing, of saying that you need to get people intellectually to grasp what Christian faith is about. But I was working with a really lovely man who was a part-time vicar of a church there, and also part-time chaplain of the Dick Whittington Hospital, big hospital in North London there, called David Curry, who has been, I only worked with him for a few days, but he was really important to me. He very gently took me aside as we were walking somewhere one day, and he said, you know, I've been a vicar for a long time, Richard, and he said, I've never known anybody become a Christian because they lost an argument. And I've thought of that many, many times since. And I think actually what he was cottoning on to is some of what's going on in this passage. Jesus is talking about concrete actions. It's not that arguments don't matter, they do. But they're not the primary thing that makes a difference, usually. It's concrete actions that often are the most important. So we've whizzed through that passage, as I say, sorry not to give you a little more time to kind of look at it yourselves, but I hope that's helpful to set some new context and things. And I want quite briefly, in last sort of 10 minutes or so, to go on to have a think about a couple of other passages which we will really only skate over, but I think are connected here. Because when I was looking at this, I thought, well, concrete actions, how do they work out? There is another really important concrete action, or two concrete actions that Jesus talks about. And one is washing feet. You'll be familiar with this. This is John's Gospel, so we've moved Gospels now. John chapter 13. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but John has a long section, several chapters, which are usually labelled as being the Last Supper, except that he doesn't actually mention a meal, which is intriguing. There doesn't seem to be food on the table, instead there are feet. Not a great exchange, really, is it? Because John presents this story here by saying that during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he'd come from God and was going to God, got up from supper, took off his outer robe, tied a towel round himself, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet. Now, as we were hearing just now, we've been reading this for nearly 2,000 years. And so we don't quite notice the sudden change of gear in that. But just listen again. Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God. This is John presenting us with Jesus as, effectively, what will become understood as the second person of the Trinity. It's an amazing vision. But what he does then is to pick up the towel, pour out some water. There's a huge gear shift there, isn't there? Again, if you think back to the kind of original context there. And then a little bit later on in the passage, Jesus says, so if I've washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I've set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. It's the night before the cross. This set of chapters 13 to 17 of John's Gospel, have been described as the kind of last will and testament of Jesus. He's trying to get things across to the disciples. And so this is another acted parable, really. Washing feet is a loving act that could not be compelled from somebody. This is pretty much the one thing that a slave could refuse to do because it's so demeaning. But actually it's what Jesus does and says, I've set you an example. Or you might say, I've given you a template. Jesus was a carpenter, and carpenters, dressmakers, people who work with their hands and create things, who make things that are beautiful, do it according to a pattern, don't they? And that's what this action is, this acted parable is. I don't think it actually means that literally, in our context, you go around pulling people's socks off so that you wash it. I mean, by all means have a go sometimes, but there is some translation work here, but the act is a loving act that is done for other people that in fact is demeaning for you. It's how God's love is shown. This is the way that we hear about it in John's Gospel. But it's another concrete action on Jesus' part, isn't it? And then in Luke, dotting back to Luke chapter 9 verse 23, we also say here, and then Jesus said to them all, if any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross daily and follow me. Luke has put in the daily bit. Mark and Matthew both quote Jesus as saying to take up their cross and follow me. But Luke adds in that daily thing, which suggests an extra level of interpretation that's going on there. But I wonder if what he's doing there is pointing us towards the way in which you can't physically be crucified every day, can you? This must be some kind of metaphorical phrase. Is it about that same stuff that you see with the washing of feet? That same sense that what you do is demean yourself. You show a loving act by taking that kind of servant place. This is what makes something beautiful. When we look at that phrase, do good. How do you do good? Well, here are some examples of how Jesus seems to make something beautiful in these situations, and therefore challenges us in different ways to do the same. And if you kind of widen the camera angle and look a bit more broadly, you'll find in Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11 what the American New Testament scholar Michael Gorman calls Paul's master narrative. And that's the third passage that's printed there. Intriguingly, the scholars think that this is not actually Paul speaking, apart from that very first line, which says, let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. And then the rest of that passage is, we think, in fact, a hymn that was in use within the churches. Now, bear in mind, of course, that Paul's letters are written before the Gospels are written. So you're going back actually pretty early on in the Christian movement here. So that what you seem to have here is something that amounts to a very early kind of version of a Christian creed. And it says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore God exalted him even more highly and gave him the name that's above every name, so that at the name given to Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I'm sure you're familiar with that. It often feels to me as if we lost all of the rest of the New Testament, but that bit survived, we'd be all right. What Gorman picks out when he calls this Paul's master narrative is, again, that the words are slippery just at the beginning. Because pretty well every mainstream translation will say, although, he existed in the form of God. In other words, what Jesus does in submitting to the cross is, as it were, against his nature, against the nature of God. But, says Michael Gorman, it doesn't have to be translated that way. It could be because. And if you read it that way, it's different. Who, because he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself. In other words, this is what God is like. Now, you can't actually tell which meaning is meant here, but there's enough ambiguity there that I think gives us a very rich sense of ambiguity and helps us to see that perhaps if what we see in Jesus that runs through that saying about loving your enemies and how you react to that you find there particularly in the washing of feet and the idea of taking up the cross. Thinking again about the end of the first Luke passage about be merciful as your Father is merciful. Actually, what you're being called to do in loving your enemies is doing it because God is like that. You still with me? And going back to some of the discussion we were just having before worship, before lunch, I think if you look back over the centuries, actually you can see that Jesus' way has worked. It's not a straight line. I'm not rehabilitating the kind of doctrine of progress here. But there are ways in which you can see that the world has changed over 2,000 years as the Christian church, often dimly and always imperfectly, has tried to embrace this sense that we walk in the footsteps of God and we walk in a way that reflects the nature of God around us. That we do good and we make something beautiful with our enemies, out of our enemies, the way that we react to them. There we are. As we were talking about the questions with Bishop Harron and with Rachel that we had at the end of his session, the thing that I was dying to say really about the question of, what happens when Bonhoeffer appears to switch from, an idealist to a kind of realist position. That's not quite what you said, Rachel, but that was the question. But the point about it that I would want to bring out is Bonhoeffer, as you mentioned earlier on, Rachel, emphasises again and again incarnation. It's about incarnation, not principles, as I understand it for him. And incarnation is always messy. That's why there often aren't hard and fast rules about how you do good, about how you make something beautiful. Because actually what you're doing often is making it up as you go along. But actually, if you think about it, that's what incarnation is about as well. It's getting involved in the messiness of the world in a way that becomes almost impossible at times to have a handbook for. That's the problem for me with more conservative approaches to Christian faith, because they assume very often that there's a particular set of rules that you've got to follow. And it doesn't seem to me that that's really what incarnation is about. Incarnation is often a way of confrontation. And a key phrase there is that one from Proverbs 31 verse 9, open your mouth for the dumb. So a way of doing good, of making something beautiful, can often be through forms of confrontation. And I think what we see in this passage in Luke chapter 6 is actions which often are confronting there and may need to be confronting on behalf of other people. I put that verse in there particularly because Proverbs 31 gets a very bad rep because the later part of the chapter is the stuff about the wonderful wife. What people don't notice is that at the beginning of that chapter, it's supposedly some stuff from somebody who's called Lemuel, king of Massa, and it's a prescription for how rulers should be and what they should do. What people often miss is the fact that it says, these are the words of Lemuel, king of Massa, words that his mother taught him. So these are, words in the Hebrew Bible which appear to have come from a woman who's in fact not even a Jewish woman, because if you look for where Massa is, it's outside the boundaries of Israel as well. And there's a lot of important stuff in that passage, but no time to look at that one as well. But that idea that over the centuries Jesus' way has worked, I think you see that, for example, in Martin Luther King's famous phrase, in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, Montgomery, Alabama, where he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." That, I think, is, there's an element of hope for us in this. Does it work? Well, it's not necessarily about things working or not working, but actually, if you look, you see that the world has changed, I think. So, let me give you a quick epilogue. Naomi and I hadn't conferred about this. How's a way of putting this into practice? Let me tell you a little of the story of Coventry Cathedral, some of which you will know. This is because I work in the Diocese of Coventry and have done for a long time now. You probably know the story of what happened. November the 14th, 1940, there was a devastating air raid on Coventry and 568 people were killed, which at the time was I think it was the largest number in a single night in Coventry, in Britain. And this is what the ruins looked like the next morning. The paintings from the artist John Piper, who was sent to Coventry the day after to record it in art. But you've also got this famous photograph of the west doors blown off and just the hinges left there. How would they react? How would people react at that point? There was an extraordinary man called Dick Howard, who was the provost, in effect the vicar of the cathedral at the time. And actually, interestingly, controversially, the Sunday immediately before the bombing was Remembrance Sunday, and at that service he had particularly prayed for those who they were at war with, and he had also made sure that the confession clearly was about the fact that everybody, by which he meant both Britain and Germany, were at fault for the war. That was pretty controversial at the time. But it meant that when the place was destroyed, there's a sense in which he was able to respond in a way that again was quite controversial, but is remarkable in the context of what we're talking about. The BBC broadcast from the ruins at Christmas, so this is 6 weeks later. And Dick Howard said, 6 weeks ago the enemy came and hurled down fire and destruction upon our city from the sky, all through the long night. So many lives were lost, so many homes destroyed, and our cathedral nave and chancel utterly burnt and brought to the ground. It was ruthless, futile, and wicked. And I don't know if you can see that what happened, what he was able to point out, when he climbed the spire, the tower of the cathedral, which stayed standing, so actually a separate structure, he looked down in the ruins, and there in the ruins, you may just be able to make it out, one of the roof beams had fallen into the shape of a cross. You've got to squint to do it properly, but I promise you it is there. And what he later wrote was, as I stood there, I asked the question, where is God? And I saw the cross there, and the answer came to me that when people suffer, God suffers with them. Bonhoeffer famously said, only a suffering God can help. I'm not saying that Howard got there first, but I'm saying that there is a connection between the two things, out of that lived experience, I think. And so, where Dick Howard went with that, in that same broadcast, and remember this is Christmas 1940, so it's an extraordinary time to say it. He said, what we want to tell the world is this, that with Christ born again in our hearts today, we're trying hard as it may be to banish all thoughts of revenge. We're bracing ourselves to finish this tremendous job of saving the world from tyranny and cruelty, but we are going to try to make a kinder, simpler, a more Christ-child-like sort of world in the days beyond this strife. Lots of people responded positively. Lots of people thought it was absolutely ridiculous to be saying that at that point. But it was a brave thing to say, and I think it's a good example. of trying to make something beautiful out of those who hate you. I think my time's up probably, so thank you
We've got
for
6
listening.
minutes actually. Great.
6 minutes. Any thoughts or observations, please feel free. Yeah.
I was intrigued by what you were saying earlier on about. Thank you. I was intrigued by what you were saying earlier on about that sort of dialogue where you say to somebody, "Is this the person you are?"
Yes.
And I'm contrasting that with a phrase which has been bugging me for the last few days, and that is the phrase calling racism out.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes when we talk about calling something out, it suggests that once we call it out, it'll somehow disappear in a puff of logic. And actually, sometimes the calling doesn't actually help. The calling of the use to the label doesn't help. And sometimes I think back to, when I was a child struggling to overcome a lot of inherent racism, I would not have identified myself as a racist. And for somebody to have pointed to me and said, "You're racist," my future self to say, "You're a racist," would not have helped. But for somebody to say to you, "You're not a racist, so why are you saying that?" And I think that is part of that sort of polarized way of engaging with the enemy, is to say, "Are you like that? Is that what you are?
Yeah.
Surely you're not like that. Surely we're not like that."
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just behind you, I think.
I just wanted to say that I was in the craftivism workshop just before this, and a number of people were, and there was very significant parallels with what you were saying and what we were doing before
That's
this
always
session.
a relief to hear, yes.
And it's in particularly the whole thing of making something beautiful, and we learnt about how the Leeds Sanctuary craftivists make these beautiful things, and they sent some olive branches, I think, to leaders of an arms fair, and just the idea of sending beautiful things to people that hate you is exactly what you were saying.
Great, thank you. There we are, got one here.
So you're talking about how we need to make something beautiful in the face of conflict. One issue is that for someone to allow something beautiful to be made, that itself is an act of humility, often, to allow yourself to be helped. So how can you make something beautiful in the face of pride?
I mean, I think Rachel made some good comments about that earlier on. I think it's about trying, isn't it? You can't force it to happen, and that's really important, because people have agency. We can't make it happen, but we can try. That's the call to us, I think. That's a bit of a rubbish answer, isn't it? But that's where I would be, I think.
I wonder if that relates to what we were saying in the theatre workshop. Were you in that or not? No. Yes, you were. Yeah, no. We can't change what person one is saying. We can change our response to it. I wonder if that maybe comes in as well. Sorry.
We were leading the workshop, so I'll give some context in terms of who person one is for anyone in the craftivism. Basically, we were looking at Freire's work of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which then led to Boal's work of Theatre of the Oppressed, and his idea in forum theatre is that you cannot change the oppressor's actions, you can only change your own, as in the oppressed actions, because that's the groups he was working with in the 60s and 70s. It was oppressed groups, particularly in Brazil and Argentina. So that's a little bit of a context on that. We can change our actions, we can make something beautiful, say a good thing, make a lovely craft, or put something on social media, but we can't affect how the oppressor, the agitator, the person who hates us reacts to that. We can only affect our own actions.
Thank you. I think we better finish there, partly because Naomi's never known me finish a minute early, and I'd just like to make that point. I've managed to do so.
I'm a terrible taskmaster, and all my current staff will attest.
I just want to say thank you very much for that session. And it is now coffee break time.